Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, glad to find you settled and still. Tell me, is there paper nearby? Perhaps ink? The faint smell of something written and considered. These are the quiet companions of a thinking evening. In such hours, Watson sat closest to the truth, not chasing it, but allowing it to arrive, one careful observation at a time. Do subscribe to Watson's Margins, so these reflections reach you whenever you need them most. Now, draw your chair a little closer, for as Holmes understood, it is the detail others overlook that illuminates everything. You'll find the Watson's Margins Spotify channel linked in the description below. Chapter 1. The Visitor from Lincoln's Inn. It has been my experience, gathered across many years of close association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, that the most singular cases do not announce themselves with any great theatre. They arrive, as this one did, on a damp autumn morning when the yellow fog lay so thickly upon Baker Street that the gas lamps burned with a wan and spectral light, and the sounds of the city were muffled to the vagueness of a half-remembered dream. Holmes sat by the window in his mouse-coloured dressing-gown, a volume of monograph papers spread across his knee. Absorbed in what he had that morning informed me was a study of medieval legal shorthand, a subject which had engaged him, he said, for the better part of 3 days. I'd breakfasted alone, for Holmes had declined Mrs. Hudson's offerings with a characteristic wave of his long hand, and had since occupied his chair with the rigid stillness of a man whose mind is far too active for his body to require movement. I settled myself by the fire with the morning papers, though even their columns of parliamentary debate and colonial dispatches seemed, on that sullen October day, to belong to some livelier world than the one pressing its grey face against our windows. It was shortly past 10 o'clock when we heard the bell, and then the careful tread of a young man ascending the stair, careful in the manner of one who wishes to appear composed, but who is, in truth, under considerable strain. Holmes set aside his monograph without a word and straightened in his chair. He had heard it too. Our visitor was a young man of perhaps 28, slight in build, with fine pale features and the ink-stained fingers of one who works long hours by artificial light. He was dressed in the correct, if somewhat threadbare fashion of a junior barrister, his black coat well pressed, but showing at the cuffs the faint gloss of frequent use. He carried beneath his arm a leather satchel which he gripped rather too tightly for casual confidence, and when Mrs. Hudson showed him in, his grey eyes moved immediately to Holmes with an expression that combined relief and apprehension in almost equal measure. "Mr. Holmes," he said, and his voice was educated, precise, though with a faint tension running beneath it, as a wire runs beneath varnished wood. "My name is Adrian Whittaker. I'm a junior barrister practising from chambers at Lincoln's Inn. I have come to you upon a matter which I confess I hardly know how to characterise, whether as a legal curiosity, a criminal intrigue, or something else entirely." "Sit down, Mr. Whittaker," Holmes said. "You have not slept well these past 2 nights. The matter, whatever it is, has been occupying you rather more than your professional composure would suggest. Pray, leave characterisation to me, and confine yourself to the facts." Our visitor looked momentarily startled, as visitors to Baker Street invariably do at such an opening, and then took the chair I indicated. He set his satchel upon his knee and drew from it, with the deliberateness of a man who has rehearsed this gesture, a folded document enclosed in a legal wrapper. "This was delivered anonymously to my chambers 4 days ago," he said. "It was left upon my clerk's desk during a brief interval in which the outer office was unattended. There was no covering letter beyond this." He produced a small card and placed it upon Holmes's outstretched palm, which accompanied the document. Holmes examined the card. It bore 6 words, written in a neat, deliberate hand. "The truth will not remain buried." "And the document itself?" Holmes said. Whittaker unwrapped the outer covering and laid the pages before Holmes with a gesture that was almost reverent. "It purports to be an indictment," he said. "An unsigned indictment directed against Sir Lionel Markham." The name required no elaboration. Sir Lionel Markham was known to any reader of the legal press as one of the most respected magistrates upon the London bench, a man approaching retirement after a career of notable probity. His name had never, to my knowledge, been linked with anything other than the strictest administration of justice. The document accuses Sir Lionel, Whittaker continued, of having perverted justice during a fraud trial some 15 years ago, a case in which a man named Dacre was convicted of embezzlement and sentenced to a term of imprisonment from which he did not, as I understand it, survive. The accusation is that witness testimony was tampered with before that trial, that certain statements were altered or suppressed. Serious allegations, I remarked. Serious and in themselves remarkable, Holmes said, who had been turning the pages of the document with characteristic care, barely touching the edges. But there is something further. There is, said Whittaker. Portions of the document, specifically those passages which describe the alleged tampering in detail, are written not in plain English, but in cipher. I leaned forward at that, for I had not expected it. Holmes said nothing, but I observed a quickening of attention in his lean face, a slight elevation of the brows. Nay, that told me the case had, for him, just become considerably more interesting. The document was perhaps 12 pages in length. The greater part was written in the conventional language of a legal indictment, formal, measured, and precise. But here and there, at intervals that seemed to correspond to the most specific and damaging portions of the accusation, the text gave way to a dense and unfamiliar arrangement of abbreviations, symbols, and what appeared to be archaic procedural notations. These passages read as complete nonsense to the uninitiated eye, yet they possessed a regularity and system that spoke of genuine design rather than mere obscuration. "A cipher," Holmes said softly, more to himself than to either of us. He rose, carried the document to the window and held certain pages against what thin grey light the fog permitted. "Extraordinary." "I showed it to a colleague," Whittaker said, "a Mr. Julian Fenton, also of Lincoln's Inn. He is a man of wider legal scholarship than myself, familiar with old chancery forms. He could make nothing of the encoded passages, though he agreed they possessed internal consistency." "And Sir Lionel Markham himself?" Holmes asked, without turning from the window. "Have you approached him?" "I have not. The document came to me anonymously, and I was uncertain. I remain uncertain as to my proper course of action. If the accusations are baseless, I should not wish to distress a distinguished man upon the strength of an anonymous paper. If they are founded in truth, the matter requires far more delicate handling than I am equipped to provide alone." "You have acted wisely in coming here," Holmes said, and returned to his chair with the document still in his hand. "Tell me of the individuals connected with the old trial, so far as you know them." Whittaker composed himself and spoke with the orderly precision of a man accustomed to marshalling evidence. Sir Lionel Markham, he confirmed, was a magistrate of long standing who had presided over the Dacre embezzlement trial at a period when he was still in the earlier stages of his judicial career. Mr. Tobias Greaves, Sir Lionel's confidential clerk, he had served him throughout that period and continued to do so to the present day, a man of methodical temperament and long loyalty. Mrs. Eleanor Dacre, the widow of the convicted man, was still living, modestly and in obscurity, and had over the years written to various authorities protesting her husband's innocence, without, as far as Whittaker knew, any result. And there was Fenton himself, who had come across the document when Whittaker, at a loss, had sought a second opinion. "A respectable cast of characters," Holmes observed when Whittaker had finished. "I can conceive of none of them as conspirators," Whittaker said, with a slight earnest frown. "Greaves is an old man utterly devoted to his employer. Mrs. Dacre is a grieving widow. Sir Lionel is Sir Lionel. And you?" Holmes said with the mild, disarming pleasantness he employed when the question carried most weight. Whittaker blinked. "I am, as I said, the recipient of the document. I know nothing of its origin." Holmes accepted this without further remark, though I caught the faintest narrowing of his eyes. He asked several more questions: the precise date of the document's delivery, the arrangement of Whittaker's chambers, the names of his clerk and the regular occupants of neighbouring rooms, and then rose. which was his signal that the consultation was at its end. "I will take the case," he said simply. "Leave the document with me. Yeah, you may expect to hear from me within a day or two." Whittaker expressed his relief with a visible relaxing of the shoulders and departed with the lightened step of a man who has transferred a burden he has been carrying too long. Holmes went immediately to the window and watched him go. The fog swallowed the young barrister before he had gone 20 yards. "Well, Holmes," I said, "a curious business. Do you think there is any truth in the accusation against Sir Lionel?" Holmes did not answer at once. He stood at the window for a long moment, his pipe unlit in his hand, his pale eyes fixed upon some point in the obscured street below. "Our young barrister is anxious," he said at last, "though not, I think, for Sir Lionel's reputation." I waited for him to say more, but he had already taken up the ciphered document again and carried it to the lamp, and I knew by the quality of his silence that the real work of the case had already begun. Chapter 2. The Cipher Examined. Holmes did not sleep that night. I know this not from any confession on his part. He was not a man given to admitting bodily limitation, but because when I came down to breakfast at 7:30 the following morning, the lamp above the chemical bench was still burning, the room smelled of pipe tobacco in 3 or 4 distinct waves of accumulation. Yeah, and the ciphered document lay at the centre of the table, surrounded by a constellation of notes, magnifying lenses and reference volumes drawn from every quarter of our shelves. Holmes himself stood at the window in his shirt-sleeves, looking out at a Baker Street that had exchanged the previous day's fog for a cold, pewter-grey drizzle, and he turned when he heard my step with the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere after a long journey. "Sit down, Watson," he said. "There is coffee. Mrs. Hudson, bless her, left it an hour ago. It will be strong enough by now to dissolve a horseshoe, which is precisely what I require." I poured and settled myself at the table, taking care not to disturb the arrangement of papers. Holmes crossed from the window and stood at the far edge of the table, regarding his night's work with the detached satisfaction of a painter who has at last caught a likeness. "Tell me what you make of it," I said, gesturing at the document. "I will tell you what I have made of it," he replied, drawing up his chair, "which is a rather different thing, and rather more useful." He lifted the first pages of the indictment and tilted them toward the grey light from the window. "The paper first. You observe the watermark." I leaned closer. Against the light, a faint device was visible in the weave of the paper, a set of balanced scales within an oval border with a small serif letter beneath. "A legal stationer's mark," I said. Precisely. A stationer who operates almost exclusively from premises within Lincoln's Inn and its immediate environs. He supplies, as I ascertained this morning from his published catalogue, chambers, clerks, and a small number of specialist practitioners. His watermark is in the trade considered something of a distinction. One does not use his paper without having either a direct account with him or a connection to someone who does. Holmes set the page down. "The paper is not anonymous. It belongs to a world." "Lincoln's Inn," I said. "Lincoln's Inn." He picked up his magnifying lens and moved to a passage midway through the document, one of the cipher sections. "Now attend to the ink. In ordinary light it appears uniform, but under the lens, and with the aid of a reagent test I performed around 2 this morning, it tells a different tale." The plain text portions of this indictment were composed in a good commercial writing ink, freely available and unremarkable. The cipher portions, however, were set down in an ink of slightly different formulation, a slightly higher iron content, marginally different viscosity, as you can see from the behaviour of the strokes at their ends. He passed me the lens and indicated the passage. I examined it as directed. Now that he had drawn my attention to it, the difference was perceptible. The cipher symbols had a faint brownish undertone at the edges of their strokes, a characteristic the plain text did not share. 2 different inks, I said. Composed, therefore, at 2 different times and almost certainly in 2 different locations, or at 2 different writing occasions, Holmes said, resuming his chair. The document was not written at a single sitting. The plain text was composed first, and the cipher sections inserted subsequently. That is significant, Watson. because it tells us the writer did not compose cipher and plain text simultaneously, as a fluent user of the system might do, but returned to the document to add the encoded passages. He needed, in other words, to consult something before he could complete them. I set down the lens. What is the cipher itself? Holmes pressed the tips of his fingers together in the manner I knew well, the gesture of a man assembling a structure he has already built in his mind, but now merely choosing the order in which to present its parts. It is not a substitution cipher in the conventional sense, he said. There is no simple alphabet underlying it, no mechanical shift of letters. When I first examined it, the density and variety of the symbols suggested a complexity that, on closer analysis, proved somewhat illusory. The system is better described as a legal transformation. The writer has taken ordinary English phrases, declarative, factual, the kind found in witness depositions and procedural summaries, and rendered them through a system of archaic court abbreviations and obsolete procedural notation. Forms that were in common use apparently in certain chancery proceedings of the previous century, but which have long since passed out of practical employment. Then it is a form of disguise rather than true encryption. You have it exactly. Holmes permitted himself a brief thin smile. It is a disguise intended not for a cryptanalyst, but for a reader already familiar with its key. Someone who possessed the right reference works could decode it with patience. Someone without them would find it entirely opaque. He rose and lifted one of the volumes from the table, a thick cloth-bound work with gilt lettering much worn from the spine. I could make out the words Compendium of Chancery Forms before he set it open at a marked page. This volume, and two others of similar vintage, provided most of what I needed. I found them on our own shelves, Watson. You may recall I purchased a job lot of legal reference texts 18 months ago in connection with the Harrington will affair. I remember you paid rather too much for them. I paid precisely what they were worth. No more, no less, and last night considerably less. He settled once more and drew the decoded passages toward him, sheets of his own hand in which the cipher text had been rendered into plain English. The encoded sections describe, in specific and detailed terms, the alleged irregularities in the Dacre fraud trial. Witness statements, it is claimed, were altered prior to being placed before the court. A deposition from a particular financial broker, one whose evidence might have cast doubt upon Dacre's culpability, was apparently suppressed altogether. The tampering, if it occurred, was surgical rather than wholesale, enough to tilt the balance of the case, but not so gross as to invite obvious scrutiny. The rain tapped steadily at the windows. I thought of Mrs. Eleanor Dacre in her modest Bloomsbury rooms, and of a man convicted upon testimony that had, perhaps, been quietly shaped against him. If any of this is true, I said, it is a very serious matter indeed. If, Holmes said, the document makes the claims, whether they have any foundation in fact remains entirely another question, and one we cannot answer from this table. He gathered the decoded sheets into a neat stack. What I can say with confidence is this. The person who composed this document possessed an intimate familiarity with legal forms, both modern and archaic. They had access to paper from within the Lincoln's Inn network. They were careful enough to separate the most damaging material behind a cipher, yet not confident enough to compose that cipher without consulting references. They took pains, Watson. Considerable pains, but they were not entirely fluent in the system they employed. A careful but inexperienced hand, I said, recalling a phrase Holmes had used to me before. He looked at me with a glance of brief approval. Precisely so. There is something in this document of the student rather than the master, the quality of someone who has studied a subject diligently but has not yet worn it smooth with use. He rose and took up his pipe. We shall call on Mrs. Dacre this afternoon. Whatever she knows or does not know, her account of the original trial will give us ground to stand on, and I wish to form my own impression of the woman before Lestrade has the opportunity to form his. He said the last with a dryness that told me he had already calculated the direction in which official suspicion would travel, toward the most obvious candidate, the one with the longest and most publicly stated grievance. It was the direction logic appeared to invite, and I had learned, across many years at Holmes's side, that the path logic appeared to invite was often the one he was most careful not to take without first examining the ground beneath his feet. I finished my coffee and went to find my coat and hat. Outside, the drizzle had thickened to a steady London rain, and the street below glistened like hammered pewter in the dull morning light. Chapter 3. The Widow's Accusation. Bloomsbury in the Rain has a particular quality of melancholy that I have always found distinct from the melancholy of other London quarters. It is not the raw, industrial sadness of Whitechapel, nor the hollow grandeur of a Mayfair house gone to seed. It is quieter than either. The sadness of respectable, reduced circumstances, of curtains kept clean by habit rather than hope, of front steps still whitened by a woman who has long since ceased to expect visitors of any consequence. These Eleanor Dacre's lodgings in a narrow terrace off Montague Street had precisely that character. The brass knocker was polished. The single window box held the last brown remnants of summer flowers no one had yet removed. The house announced without a word that its occupant had not surrendered to misfortune, only been worn gradually smaller by it. Holmes knocked, and we were admitted by Mrs. Dacre herself. There was evidently no servant, and shown into a sitting room that was neat, cold, and very quiet. She was a woman of perhaps 50, though she looked older than her years in the manner of those who have sustained a long unresolved grief. Her face had been handsome once and retained its structure, but the eyes were watchful in the particular way of someone accustomed to disbelief, and she studied Holmes with an attention that was neither welcoming nor hostile but carefully measuring. "Mr. Holmes," she said, when we had introduced ourselves and taken the chair she indicated, "I know your name. I wrote to you once some years ago." "You did," Holmes said. "I was at that time engaged in a matter which prevented me from taking up your case. I regret it." I was not certain whether this was true or a diplomatic courtesy, but its effect was immediate. Something in Mrs. Dacre's posture shifted, not softened precisely, but unlocked, as though a bolt had been drawn back. "Then you know why I wrote," she said. "I know what you wrote," Holmes replied. "I should prefer now to hear what you say." She folded her hands in her lap and spoke with the compressed, practised quality of a woman who has told this story many times and learned to keep its edges from unravelling. Her husband, Mr. George Dacre, had been a clerk of modest standing employed by a firm of city merchants. In the spring of 1879 he had been charged with embezzling funds from his employers over a period of 2 years. He had denied it from the first moment to the last. The trial had been heard before Sir Lionel Markham, who was then, as Mrs. Dacre put it with thin precision, rather newer to the bench than his current reputation might suggest. He was convicted on the testimony of 2 witnesses, she said, men employed by the same firm, and upon certain account documents which, I was always told, demonstrated the discrepancies beyond question. She paused, but there was a 3rd witness, a broker by the name of Sefton, who had dealings with my husband's employers, and who had written a statement, a sworn statement, suggesting that the transactions my husband was accused of arranging were, in fact, authorised at a senior level within the firm. If that statement had been placed before the court, the picture would have been very different. And it was not placed before the court, Holmes said. It was never produced. When my husband's counsel asked for it, he was told it could not be located. It had been submitted to the court clerk's office for filing and had simply ceased to exist. The bitterness in those last 3 words was absolute, though her voice did not rise. My husband died in Pentonville in the 2nd year of his sentence. A fever, they said. The room was very still. I found I could not look at her directly for a moment, and occupied myself with an examination of the mantelpiece, where a small photograph in a black frame showed a man of middle age with a direct, steady gaze. Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Dacre, I must put a question to you plainly, and I ask you to answer it with equal plainness. Have you at any time in recent months composed, or caused to be composed, any document purporting to be a formal indictment of Sir Lionel Markham? She looked at him steadily. I have not. I have written letters to the Home Office, to the Lord Chancellor's Department, to 3 members of Parliament, and to the editor of the Law Journal, none of whom saw fit to reply. Letters, Mr. Holmes, not indictments. Have you any knowledge of such a document being prepared by another? None whatsoever, though I confess. She hesitated, and for the first time something uncertain crossed her face. I confess it would not distress me to learn that someone had taken up the matter with rather more force than I have been able to manage alone. Holmes nodded, and then asked whether she had kept any correspondence from the period of the trial. She had. She rose and went to a writing desk in the corner of the room, and from its lower drawer produced a bundle of papers tied with faded ribbon. Letters from her husband during his imprisonment, and a smaller collection of documents relating to the trial itself. She placed them in Holmes's hands with the careful deliberateness of someone handing over something precious. He examined them for some minutes in a silence that I had learned not to interrupt. He turned pages slowly, held certain passages to the light, and occasionally tilted a sheet to examine the texture of the writing rather than its content. At one point he set the trial-related papers to one side, and went through her husband's prison letters with a particular focused attention, pausing over 2 or 3 of them with an expression I could not quite read. Then he retied the bundle and returned it to her with a courtesy that was entirely sincere. Your husband wrote a clear, upright hand, he observed. He had been a clerk for 20 years, she said simply. Holmes asked several further questions about the broker Sefton, whether she knew what had become of him, whether her husband had ever met him personally, whether any record of his original statement had survived in any form. To each of these she gave what answers she could, which were partial and incomplete. Sefton, she believed, had left London within a year of the trial, and she had lost all trace of him. No copy of his statement, nor to her knowledge, existed anywhere. We were preparing to take our leave when there was a knock at the front door, and a moment later the solid figure of Inspector Lestrade filled the narrow hallway. He affected surprise at finding us there, though I did not entirely believe it. Mr. Holmes, he said, with his customary mixture of professional wariness and personal goodwill. Dr. Watson, I might have known. He removed his hat and addressed Mrs. Dacre directly. I am sorry to intrude, ma'am. I have a few questions about your recent movements in the vicinity of Lincoln's Inn. Mrs. Dacre received this without visible alarm, which itself seemed to me a mark in her favour. I have been there twice in the past month, she said calmly. I went to inquire at the offices of a solicitor regarding a small matter of lease renewal. I can give you his name and address. Lestrade wrote this down with the air of a man who has expected complication and found only tidiness, which plainly unsettled him more than the alternative would have done. Before we parted on the wet pavement outside, he drew Holmes a few steps along the street. She's the obvious candidate, he said, in the tone of a man who is most confident precisely when he ought to be least so. Long grievance, recently in the neighbourhood, and we've had word that a scrap of watermarked legal paper, same mark as the indictment document, was found among items she left behind at a public reading room near the inn. Holmes expressed no opinion. He received this intelligence with a courteous inclination of the head, and said only that it was very interesting, which I recognised as the precise phrase he employed when he thought something was anything but. In the cab returning to Baker Street, he sat with his coat collar turned up, and his gaze directed at nothing in particular beyond the streaming window, and I knew better than to speak. It was only as we turned into Baker Street itself that he said, quietly and apparently to the middle distance, "She did not write that document, Watson." "You are certain?" I asked. "The handwriting in those prison letters, her husband's hand, which she would have studied for months, perhaps years, in the loneliness of her grief, bears no relationship to the formations in the cipher, and the woman has neither the legal vocabulary nor, I suspect, the temperament for such an exercise. She is straightforward in her anger. The author of that indictment was not." He climbed from the cab and looked up at the dull sky for a moment before ascending our steps. Lestrade will follow the obvious path. It is what Lestrade does. Our task is to follow the correct one. Chapter 4. The Clerk's Testimony. There are men whose entire existence appears to have been organised in service of another, and who have performed this organisation so completely and for so long that it becomes impossible to imagine them apart from it. Mr. Tobias Greaves was such a man. He had served Sir Lionel Markham for the better part of 3 decades, and the service had left its mark upon him as thoroughly as a river leaves its mark upon a stone, not worn away, but shaped, directed, defined. He received us in a small anteroom adjoining Sir Lionel's private offices near the Strand, and the first impression he made was of extraordinary, almost architectural neatness. His desk was a model of regulated order. His coat was brushed to a degree that suggested daily attention rather than occasional care. Even his white hair, which was considerable, lay with a precision that seemed less the product of a comb than of long-established will. He was a man of 70 or thereabouts, with a face that had been weathered into deep settled lines, and eyes of a pale steady blue that assessed us both before he spoke a word. When Holmes had explained that we were conducting certain inquiries connected with the Dacre fraud case of 15 years prior, without, I noted, specifying the nature of those inquiries or the existence of the ciphered document, those eyes narrowed by the smallest perceptible degree and then resumed their habitual calm. A very old matter, Greaves said. His voice was dry and precise, each word placed like a document in its correct folder. "Old matters have a way of returning," Holmes replied pleasantly, and took the chair indicated. Greaves confirmed, in answer to Holmes's measured questions, that he had been present throughout the administration of the Dacre trial, that the preparation and filing of documents, the receipt of depositions, and the general management of the court papers had passed through his hands in the ordinary course of his duties. He spoke of these things with a professional composure that was, in itself, entirely proper. A clerk of his experience and tenure would think nothing unusual in discussing procedural matters of 15 years' standing. "The question of missing papers," Holmes said, with the air of a man raising a purely incidental point. "It has been suggested that certain documents connected with the Dacre trial were not present when expected, a deposition in particular." Greaves was quiet for a moment. "Papers go missing," he said at last. "In any busy court administration, over a period of years, documents are misfiled, mislaid, occasionally lost. It is regrettable, but not unusual." "This particular deposition was not misfiled," Holmes said, still in the same pleasant tone. "It was submitted for filing and thereafter could not be located. The distinction is a fine one, but I think you appreciate fine distinctions, Mr. Greaves." The old clerk looked at Holmes with an expression that was neither defensive nor evasive, but rather the expression of a man who is choosing very carefully which portion of the truth to offer. "I recall that there was some difficulty at the time regarding a statement from a broker," he said. "I recall that inquiries were made. I cannot tell you more than that because I do not know more than that. What I can tell you is that in my 3 decades of service, I have never once knowingly misfiled, suppressed, or altered a document of any kind." I believed him, and I think Holmes did too, though he gave no outward sign of it. "The widow Dacre," Holmes said, shifting without preamble, "she has maintained over many years that her husband was innocent." "So I understand." A pause, brief but weighted. "I am sorry for her loss. The conviction and subsequent death of a man one believes to be innocent is a terrible thing to carry. Whether her belief has any foundation in fact is not something I am in a position to judge. Have you had any recent communication with Mrs. Dacre, or been aware of any person acting on her behalf?" "None whatever." Holmes appeared satisfied by this, or at least by the manner in which it was delivered, and allowed a silence to develop in the room. And it was the kind of silence he sometimes permitted to exist deliberately, as a space into which a man of sufficient anxiety might speak. Greaves, however, was not a man of sufficient anxiety. He sat within the silence as comfortably as he sat within his coat and waited. Holmes rose and, in the apparently idle fashion I'd come to recognise as anything but, moved along the side wall of the anteroom where a series of wooden document shelves ran from floor to near ceiling, while each bundle of papers secured with legal tape of a dark red colour. He paused before one shelf and bent to examine the nearest bundle, his hands clasped behind his back, not touching. "You have a particular method of securing your documents," he observed. Greaves glanced at the shelves. "I have used the same knot for 30 years, a double-locked binding. You will not find it in common use. I devised it myself as a young clerk, yet after losing a bundle of wills in a draft." The faintest suggestion of professional pride entered his voice. "No document secured in that manner has ever come loose on my watch." "Admirable," Holmes said, with perfect sincerity, and returned to his chair. The remainder of our conversation concerned procedural details of diminishing significance, and it was clear after a further quarter hour that Greaves had given us what he intended to give. Holmes thanked him, and we took our leave. On the pavement below I turned up my collar against a wind that had developed an easterly bite, and looked to Holmes for his assessment. "A scrupulous man," I offered. "Entirely scrupulous," Holmes agreed, "and entirely frightened." I looked at him in surprise. Nothing in Greaves's manner had suggested fear to me, rather the opposite, a settled and impervious composure. "Frightened of what?" I asked. Of the question I did not ask. Holmes set off at his long, rapid stride, and I fell in beside him. I asked him whether the missing deposition had been suppressed. I asked him whether he had communicated with Mrs. Dacre. I asked him about the missing papers in general terms. But I did not ask him whether he had any knowledge, direct or indirect, of who might have composed a formal accusation against Sir Lionel Markham. And the entire time I was in that room, Watson, Greaves was waiting for precisely that question. He had prepared himself for it. When it did not come, he was momentarily at a loss. You may have noticed a slight adjustment of his hands upon his desk after my final question. The relief of a man who's just avoided something. I considered this as we walked. Then he knows something about the indictment? He knows something. Whether he knows its author or merely suspects, I cannot yet say. But there is something in that room, some piece of knowledge, which he is protecting. The question is whether he is protecting himself, his employer, or another party altogether. Holmes paused at a crossing to allow a goods wagon to pass and then continued. "His knot, however, is the more interesting matter." "His document knot," I said, not concealing my scepticism. "Holmes, surely—" "A man who has used an idiosyncratic, double-locked binding for 30 years does so with complete unconscious consistency," Holmes said. "It becomes as habitual as a signature. Any document he has tied will bear that knot as surely as if he had initialed it." He glanced at me sideways. "The Ciphered Indictment was delivered in an outer legal wrapper, Watson. I have not mentioned this before because I wish to observe whether any other detail pointed in the same direction before drawing a conclusion. The wrapper was secured with a simple single knot, the knot of a man unaccustomed to tying legal documents, or one who gave the matter no particular thought." "Not Greaves, then," I said, following his reasoning. "Not Greaves. A veteran clerk's hands would no more tie a single knot than a pianist's, would play a wrong octave through inattention." He turned up the collar of his coat and quickened his pace. "Greaves did not compose the indictment, but I am increasingly of the view that he has formed a suspicion as to who did, and that this suspicion is causing him considerable private discomfort." We walked in silence for a time, Holmes's face set in the angular, concentrated expression that told me he was not so much thinking as organising, arranging the pieces he had already collected into the architecture of a conclusion he had not yet quite decided to commit to. The wind off the river carried with it the smell of coal smoke and tide, and the afternoon was already beginning to thicken toward early dusk. "Whitaker's chambers tomorrow morning," Holmes said as we turned at last into Baker Street. "I have a particular interest in his bookshelves." He said it lightly, as though it were an afterthought, and went directly inside without elaboration. It was, I had long since learned, the manner in which he marked the moments of sharpest certainty. Chapter 5. the barrister's chambers. Lincoln's Inn in the morning has an atmosphere wholly its own, part collegiate, part judicial. Ours with something of the cloister about its quadrangles and something of the counting house about its staircases. The buildings are handsome in a sober, undemonstrative way, as though legal dignity were a quality best expressed through restraint rather than ornament. Students and practitioners moved across the wet cobbles with the preoccupied air of people whose thoughts are perpetually running a little ahead of their feet, and the whole place smelled of damp stone, old leather, and the particular dry cold of buildings that have never quite warmed since October. Whittaker received us with a cordiality that was, I thought, marginally more studied than at our first meeting. He was dressed for the day's work, a brief lying open on his desk, and he waved us in with the gesture of a man who has been expecting the visit and prepared himself accordingly. His chambers were modest but well appointed, a working set of rooms rather than a showpiece, with the slightly compressed arrangement of a junior man making the most of limited space. Books lined 2 of the 4 walls from floor to ceiling, the majority in the dark, uniform bindings of legal texts. A writing desk occupied the window, positioned to catch the best of the north light, and beside it stood a small table bearing ink, pens, and a blotter of dark green leather considerably used. "Mr. Holmes," he said, clearing a chair of a stack of folders, "and Dr. Watson. I hope you bring news." "I bring questions," Holmes said pleasantly, settling into the offered chair and looking about the room with the unconcealed curiosity that lesser men sometimes mistook for rudeness, but which was, in fact, the most honest form of attention. "You keep a well-stocked library for a junior man." Whittaker glanced at his shelves with the mild pride of a bibliophile. "I have always found that a problem encountered in practice almost invariably has a precedent somewhere in the literature, if one is willing to look far enough back," he smiled. "My pupil master called it an antiquarian tendency. I prefer to think of it as thoroughness." "Both descriptions may be accurate," Holmes said. He had risen already and was moving along the nearest shelf with his hands still clasped behind him. The same posture he had adopted before Greaves's document bindings, reading spines rather than removing volumes, his head inclined at a slight angle. "You have works here of considerable age and rarity. This compendium of chancery forms," he paused before a thick volume in brown cloth, "is the 1821 edition, if I am not mistaken. The 1821 is the more complete, containing the appendices that the later reprints omitted." "Yes, that is the 1821, Whittaker said, with a readiness that was perfectly natural. "There is a later edition somewhere further along, but I have found the earlier one the more useful. Those appendices contain procedural forms that never made it into modern practice, but which are invaluable for understanding how certain historical arguments were constructed." "Invaluable," Holmes agreed softly and moved on. He paused twice more, once before a narrow volume lettered abbreviations of the Chancery Courts, and once before a bound collection of what appeared to be procedural digests from the latter half of the previous century. At neither did he reach out. He merely looked, with an expression of benign and scholarly interest that I had seen him deploy before and which concealed, I knew, the most precise form of examination, and I occupied myself during this interval with the ordinary courtesies of the visit, asking Whittaker whether he had received any further communications of an anonymous nature, whether he had spoken again to his colleague Fenton, whether anything in his recollection of the document's delivery had crystallized further with the passage of days. He answered each question sensibly and without apparent evasion. No further anonymous communications had arrived. He had mentioned the matter briefly to Fenton, who remained puzzled. His recollection of the document's arrival remained as he had first described it. Holmes had by now completed his circuit of the shelves and drifted to the writing desk, where he stood looking out of the window at the inn's courtyard below with the air of a man enjoying a view. In this position, his hands behind his back, he was standing directly above the green leather blotter, which lay perhaps 18 inches from his nearest hand. "The fellow students of your year," Holmes said, apparently addressing the courtyard. "Were any of them called to the Chancery Bar rather than the common law side?" Whittaker considered. "2, I think. Marchmont. He's in Lincoln's Inn still, actually, 2 staircases along, and a man named Ellery who went to the parliamentary bar. Why do you ask? Mere curiosity about the distribution of specialisms, Holmes said, and turned from the window. His eyes dropped to the blotter for the space of perhaps 1 second and then rose again to Whittaker's face. One last question, if you will permit it. The accompanying card, the one that read, "The truth will not remain buried." Do you recall whether the handwriting struck you as masculine or feminine? Whittaker paused, and in the pause I saw something flicker. Not guilt, not fear, but a quality of rapid internal calculation that was over almost before it had begun. "Masculine, I think," he said. "Firm strokes, though I confess I did not study it closely before surrendering it to you." "Of course," Holmes said. "Thank you, Whittaker. You have been most helpful." He moved toward the door with the decisiveness of a man who has finished precisely what he came to do, and I rose and followed. On the staircase, descending toward the quadrangle, I waited until we were clear of any possible hearing before speaking. "The blotter," I said. Holmes glanced at me with something approaching satisfaction. "You noticed?" "I noticed you looking at it. I could not see what you saw." "Impressions," he said. "A well-used blotter accumulates the ghost of everything written upon the desk above it, provided the writer presses with sufficient consistency. And most people press with more consistency than they realise. It is another of those unconscious habits that betray more reliably than conscious ones." We emerged into the quadrangle, and he drew his coat closer against the cold. "The blotter in that room bears, among its accumulated impressions, a series of partial marks that I recognised." "From the cipher?" "Several of the symbols appear there, faintly, and not in sequence as a completed passage would leave them, but in the scattered, exploratory pattern of a man practising, testing the forms, accustoming his hand to unfamiliar shapes before committing them to the final document." Holmes paused at the centre of the quadrangle and looked back up at the row of windows. "A student at work, Watson, exactly as I described him." I stood for a moment taking this in. Around us the inn went about its measured business, a clerk hurrying with a blue bag of papers, 2 barristers in conversation beneath an arch, a junior in wig and gown mounting a stair at speed, the ordinary machinery of the law moving in its accustomed grooves, indifferent to what Holmes had just told me. "The books," I said, "the Chancery volumes. The 1821 Compendium and its companions, the very works required to compose and decode a cipher of precisely the kind used in the indictment, available, as I confirmed last night, to very few practitioners outside this inn, and most commonly found, in my experience of these chambers, inherited or purchased as a specialist collection rather than assembled piecemeal." He resumed walking toward the gate. "Whittaker told us himself that those volumes came with the chambers from a former occupant. He did not need to acquire them. They were waiting for him." "But if all this points so firmly to Whittaker," I said, "why has he not been more guarded? Why receive us at all?" Holmes smiled, though there was little warmth in it. "Because a man who has composed an anonymous indictment and delivered it to his own chambers as its recipient occupies a position of considerable structural security. He is simultaneously the accused's accuser and the innocent victim of an unknown correspondent. To refuse our visit or to show any anxiety about our examination of his rooms would be to step outside that position. He is playing the role of the concerned young barrister who has been handed a troubling document and done the responsible thing. He is committed to the performance and must see it through." Another pause. "He is in some respects quite clever." "In some respects," I repeated, with emphasis on the qualifier. Holmes said nothing further until we reached the street. Then, as a cab slowed at his raised hand, he added, almost as an aside, "He answered my question about the handwriting on the card without any hesitation. Masculine, firm strokes. He ought to have been less certain since he claimed not to have studied it. A man recalling something genuinely Watson almost always recalls it with some imprecision. Certainty in small matters is frequently the signature of invention." He climbed into the cab and gave our Baker Street address, and I followed, turning the observation over as the wheels found the rhythm of the Strand. Outside, Lincoln's Inn receded behind us in the grey morning, its ancient stones keeping whatever other secrets they had accumulated across the centuries entirely to themselves. Chapter 6. A Reconstruction. That evening, Holmes cleared the sitting-room table with a thoroughness I had not witnessed since the Milverton affair, setting aside the chemical apparatus, the correspondence skewered to the mantelpiece, and the heap of newspapers that had been accumulating since Monday, until the surface was bare and clean in the lamplight. He then arranged upon it, with methodical deliberateness, the decoded passages from the indictment, his own notes from the past 3 days, the accompanying card, and a fresh supply of paper and pens. From the bookshelf he drew the 1821 compendium, our own copy, acquired 18 months ago and not much consulted since, and placed it open to one side. He removed his coat, rolled his cuffs, lit his pipe, and sat down. I recognised the signs. This was not the restless, prowling energy of a man working toward a conclusion. It was the concentrated stillness of one who has already reached it, and is now building the bridge by which another mind might follow. I settled in my own chair with a book I had no real intention of reading, and waited. For perhaps an hour there was no sound in the room beyond the scratch of his pen, the occasional soft collapse of coals in the grate, "Sollt there rust," and the faint percussion of rain beginning again against the glass. Holmes wrote steadily, pausing at intervals to consult the compendium, and once rising to hold a page of his own composition at arm's length, with the critical squint of a man assessing proportion. Then he sat again and continued. At last he set down his pen and looked across the room at me. "Come and see," he said. I drew my chair to the table. Holmes had filled perhaps 8 sheets of paper in his small, precise hand, and the arrangement before me showed the method of the indictment's composition reconstructed step by step, not in the speculative manner of a theorist, but with the spare, supported logic of a demonstration. "I have written 3 passages in the cipher style," he said, indicating 3 sheets set slightly apart from the others. One composed fluidly, without reference to the compendium, one composed with it open and consulted at each symbol, the one composed in the manner I believe the original writer employed, working phrase by phrase, encoding each clause before proceeding to the next, pausing between clauses to re-examine the reference. He pointed to the spacing of the symbols on each sheet. "You will observe the differences." I examined them. The first was dense and even, the symbols flowing into one another with an unbroken regularity. The second was sparser, with microscopic hesitations visible where the pen had been lifted between each form. The third exhibited a quality I can only describe as sectional, each encoded clause tight within itself, the intervals between clauses infinitesimally longer, as though the writer had briefly surfaced for air before submerging again. "The original document matches the third pattern," I said. "Throughout," Holmes confirmed. "Every encoded passage shows the same rhythmic structure. Encode, pause, consult, encode again. The pauses are not the pauses of doubt or composition. They are the pauses of reference. The writer did not hesitate over what to say. He hesitated over how to say it, because the idiom was not natural to him." He drew the decoded sheets forward. "And the content of those passages is itself revealing. The accusations they contain, the specific claims about the witness statement, the broker Sefton's deposition, and the alleged direction of the tampering, are described in the language of a summary rather than the language of direct knowledge. A man who had witnessed or participated in the original impropriety would write differently. He would write from memory, in the irregular and concrete detail of lived experience. This reads, instead, like a man who has studied a record." "A trial summary," I said, recalling what Holmes had mentioned in passing several days earlier. "You suggested such a document existed. Barristers preparing for practice at a particular level of seniority are required to review selected historic cases as part of their continuing education," Holmes said. "It is not widely advertised, but the practice is established. Summaries of notable trials, including those whose verdicts or procedures might bear examination, are maintained in the inn's own library collection and made available for this purpose. He paused and tapped the decoded sheets. The detail in these passages is too precise for newspaper accounts, of which there were very few and those very brief. It is the detail of an official summary, a document prepared for internal study. And Whittaker would have had access to such a summary. Whittaker would not merely have had access. A junior barrister in his second year of practice reading for advancement would have been positively directed toward it. Holmes leaned back and took his pipe from the ashtray. Now consider the motives. Mrs. Dacre seeks vindication for her husband. Yes, but she has sought it through letters, through proper channels, through the public record. Her method is petition, not provocation. Mr. Greaves is a man whose professional identity rests entirely upon the flawless management of documents. If there were negligence in the filing of that deposition, it was his negligence, however innocent. He would have every reason to fear exposure, but also every professional instinct to avoid the precise kind of irregular action that the indictment represents. Sir Lionel Markham, if he did indeed err in that trial, has more to lose from a public document than from private silence, and a man of his experience would know a dozen quieter ways to manage such a risk. None of these three, Watson, is served by this particular instrument. But Whittaker is, I said. Holmes drew on his pipe and regarded me steadily through the smoke. Whittaker believes, with what degree of conviction I cannot yet fully judge, that Sir Lionel Markham allowed a man to be wrongly convicted. He has read the trial summary. He has perhaps spoken to Mrs. Dacre, or read her published letters. He has formed a view that justice was obstructed, and that the obstruction has never been answered. The pipe described a slow arc. He is also a junior man of ambition in a profession that rewards, above all things, the appearance of integrity and the reality of connections. A young barrister who brings a significant judicial impropriety to light, through proper channels, with all necessary drama and none of the attendant legal risk to himself, since the document is anonymous, advances his standing considerably. He wanted the credit without the exposure, I said. He wanted to be the man who received the document, not the man who sent it. The concerned junior barrister who brought the matter responsibly to Sherlock Holmes. The instrument of justice rather than its architect. Holmes set down his pipe. The scheme has a certain elegance and a very specific flaw. I waited, but he did not name the flaw. He gathered his demonstration sheets together with care and added them to the existing pile, and then sat for some time looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of a man who has built a structure and is now inspecting it for the one weakness he suspects, but has not yet confirmed. You will find it when you look, I ventured. He glanced at me with something briefly warmer than his usual expression. I have already found it, he said, but I wish to be certain of its precise character before I present it. There is a difference between knowing a man is wrong and knowing exactly where he went wrong, and only the second is of any use in a court of reasoning. He rose and carried his notes to the writing desk in the corner, where he set them in a stack with the punctilious order of a man who expects to return to them. Lestrade has telegraphed, incidentally. He has made an arrest. Mrs. Dacre, I said with a sinking certainty. This afternoon. The watermarked paper found at the reading room combined with her admitted presence near Lincoln's Inn, and was sufficient for his purposes. Holmes did not turn from the desk. She will not be held long. Lestrade moves quickly in the wrong direction, but the evidence against her is entirely circumstantial, and a competent defence will dismantle it without difficulty. And in the meantime an innocent woman sits in custody, I said, more sharply than I had intended. Holmes was quiet for a moment. She does, he said, and the quality of the admission told me he felt the weight of it rather more than his habitual manner suggested. Which is why I intend to spend what remains of this evening confirming what I believe I know, so that tomorrow we may proceed to the matter with rather more than suspicion. He returned to the table and picked up the original Ciphered Indictment, carrying it to the lamp and holding it there at an angle I had not seen him try before. Tilted sharply, so that the light raked across the surface of the paper rather than illuminating it directly. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he made a small sound, not quite satisfaction, not quite its opposite, and carried the document back to the lamp's full light and looked again at a particular passage near the end of the 4th page. "There it is," he said, very quietly. "The floor." He did not explain further that night, and I did not press him. I had learned, across the long years of our association, that Holmes's silences at such moments were not withholding. They were completion. He had found what he was looking for, and the explanation would come when the moment was right. I banked the fire, said good night, and left him there at the lamp with the document before him, and the rain still steady against the Baker Street windows. Chapter 7. Lestrade's Conclusion. Why Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street the following morning with the particular bearing of a man who considers himself to have earned a moment of professional satisfaction. It is a bearing I had observed in him before, a slight squaring of the shoulders, a measured deliberateness of movement, the expression of one who has prepared remarks and intends to deliver them. He accepted Mrs. Hudson's offer of tea with more graciousness than usual, arranged himself in the basket chair, and looked across at Holmes with a mixture of competitive respect and barely suppressed self-congratulation that characterized him at his most dangerous. Holmes, who had been awake when I came down and showed no sign of having slept, was engaged in cutting newspaper columns with a pair of scissors and pasting them into an index scrapbook with a patience that contrasted sharply with the speed of his mind. He acknowledged Lestrade with a nod and continued his work. "You will have had my telegram," Lestrade began. "I had it," Holmes said. "Mrs. Eleanor Dacre was taken into custody yesterday at 4 o'clock. The charge at this stage is one of preparation and distribution of a false and defamatory document." Lestrade set down his cup. "I will tell you plainly what we have, since you have been engaged in the matter from the beginning, and I think it only fair." He produced a small notebook and consulted it with professional briskness. "First, Mrs. Dacre was observed near Lincoln's Inn on 2 occasions in the 5 weeks preceding the delivery of the document to Whittaker's chambers. She was identified by a porter at the inn's north gate, who recognised her from a previous visit some months earlier when she had attempted to gain access to the archival records without authorisation. "On what grounds was she refused?" Holmes asked, without looking up from his scrapbook. "She lacked the proper credentials." Access to historical trial documents requires a formal application through the inn's administration. She had written, apparently, but received no reply, and came in person. Lestrade moved on. "Second, a sheet of writing paper was found among articles she had left at a reading room near Chancery Lane, a room she used on several occasions over the past 2 months, according to the proprietor. The paper bears the same watermark as the indictment document." "1 sheet," Holmes said. "1 sheet." "Yes, unused. But the correspondence between the watermarks is exact. The paper is not in common circulation." "No," Holmes agreed mildly, "it is not." Lestrade looked at him with the slight wariness of a man who suspects encouragement, but cannot quite locate its edge. "Third, and I think this rather telling, Mr. Holmes, among her private correspondence we found 2 letters from the period immediately following her husband's trial, in which she explicitly states her intention to see Sir Lionel Markham publicly disgraced. Her words, written in considerable heat, were that she would not rest until the truth of what had been done to her husband was known to all who had trusted that man's judgment. "Written in the immediate aftermath of her bereavement," I said. "Grief expresses itself in strong language. Lestrade, it does not necessarily express itself in cipher documents 15 years later." Lestrade turned to me with a politely regretful expression he reserved for observations he considered sentimental. "With respect, Doctor, a sustained grievance is precisely the kind that eventually finds an outlet. I have seen it before," he returned to Holmes. "She had motive, opportunity, and access to the paper. The combination is compelling." Holmes set aside his scissors and scrapbook and gave Lestrade the full attention of his grey eyes. "It is a very neat construction," he said. Have you considered how Mrs. Dacre acquired working knowledge of archaic chancery abbreviations and obsolete procedural symbols? Lestrade paused for a fraction of a second. She may have had assistance. From whom? That is what further investigation will determine. I see. Holmes rose and went to the window, where he stood with his back to the room. Outside, Baker Street was going about its morning in a thin November sunshine that gave the scene a washed provisional clarity. And the question of whether Mrs. Dacre, a woman of no legal training who has spent 15 years writing respectful letters to official bodies, has suddenly elected to abandon that method in favour of a ciphered indictment composed in a highly specialised legal idiom, that question does not trouble you? People change their methods, Lestrade said, though with slightly less certainty than before. They do, Holmes allowed. Tell me, have you looked into the matter of the reading room paper rather more closely than its mere presence among Mrs. Dacre's effects? Whether, for instance, it was placed there by someone other than Mrs. Dacre? Lestrade set down his cup with rather more decision than the action required. Mr. Holmes, I appreciate that you approach these matters from a different direction than the official force, and I have on many occasions had reason to be grateful for your assistance. But the evidence in this case points in one direction with considerable consistency, and I am confident in the arrest. He stood, replacing his notebook in his coat. I came this morning as a courtesy, to keep you informed. I did not come to be talked out of a conclusion I have good grounds for holding. Holmes turned from the window and looked at him with an expression that was entirely without condescension, simply thoughtful and quite serious. I know you did not, he said, and I shall not attempt to do so this morning because I am not yet in a position to give you what you would require to release her, namely, a complete and evidenced alternative that places the composition of the indictment beyond reasonable doubt at another door. He paused. I shall be in that position shortly. I would ask only that you treat Mrs. Dacre with the consideration appropriate to a woman who has already suffered a very considerable injustice, and that you do not press the charge further until you hear from me. It was delivered quietly, without theatre, and it had precisely the effect such a tone tends to produce. Lestrade, who was a vain man in small ways but an honest one in the large, looked at Holmes for a moment with an expression in which self-assurance and doubt were conducting a rapid negotiation, and then nodded. I will give you 2 days, he said, no more. After he had gone, the room was quiet for a moment. I found I had been holding my breath slightly and released it. Holmes returned to the table and stood before his papers with his hands in his pockets, looking at the accumulated evidence of the past week with an expression I could not precisely characterize. Somewhere between calculation and something closer to reluctance. You congratulated him, I said. I beg your pardon. When Lestrade told you of the arrest? Your telegram in reply. Whittaker mentioned that Holmes had sent Lestrade a congratulatory note. I assumed at the time it was your customary diplomatic fiction. Holmes smiled, the thin, private smile that appeared rarely and meant a great deal. I congratulated him warmly, he said, and I meant a part of it sincerely. Lestrade assembled the available evidence with perfectly adequate competence. That the available evidence had been assembled for him, rather than deposited by chance, is not a failure of his reasoning. It is a failure he shares with any careful investigator who has not yet asked why the evidence is quite so conveniently available. I had been turning this over since the previous night and now gave it voice. The sheet of watermarked paper at the reading room, it was placed there. It was placed there, Holmes confirmed. Mrs. Dacre used that reading room. Her presence there was known and, I suspect, observed over a period of weeks by someone who needed a location into which a piece of incriminating material could be quietly introduced. The paper cost nothing. The risk was minimal. And it provided precisely the kind of corroborative detail that moves an investigation from suspicion to arrest. He picked up the indictment and turned it in his hands. Our author is thorough, Watson, meticulous. He prepared his trap for Mrs. Dacre with the same care he brought to the composition of the document itself, which is, in a way, the most incriminating thing about him. Because the same care appears in both, I said. Because a man who studies the cipher forms for weeks before writing them who plans the paper, who plants the evidence, who manages the timing of the delivery with precision. Such a man does not then make a casual error in the cipher itself through inattention. Holmes set the document down with a quality of finality. When such a man makes an error, Watson, it is because he does not know he has made one, and that is a very different and considerably more revealing thing. He would say nothing further on the subject that morning, but I noticed that he spent the next 2 hours at his desk with the document, a legal reference, and a patience I recognised as the patience of a man preparing not for discovery but for demonstration. The afternoon post brought nothing of significance. The evening brought a brief note from Whittaker, expressing his concern at Mrs. Dacre's arrest, and his hope that Holmes was making progress. Holmes read it, set it aside without comment, and returned to his work. But I saw, as I passed the desk on my way to bed, that he had drawn a small, as precise circle in pencil around a single symbol on the 4th page of the indictment. He had found his thread. Now he was deciding at exactly which moment to pull it. Chapter 8. The Singular Error. I came down to breakfast the next morning to find Holmes already dressed and at the table, the ciphered indictment before him, and the 1821 compendium open beside it, though he was looking at neither. He was looking at the window, with the stillness that followed completion rather than the stillness that accompanied effort, and the pencilled circle I had noticed the previous evening was now accompanied by 3 lines of annotation in the margin, written in a hand even smaller than his usual. He looked up when I entered, and there was something in his expression, a quality of decided readiness, that told me the period of quiet accumulation was over, and that what remained was the matter of deployment. "Sit down. Watson," he said, "I have something to show you, and I should value your opinion as a man of intelligence rather than legal specialism, because it is precisely upon such a man that the argument must ultimately work." This was not a form of address Holmes employed frequently, and I took my chair with a degree of attention that Mrs. Hudson's excellent kidneys and toast could not quite compete with, though I did them what justice I could while Holmes arranged the relevant materials between us. He placed the 4th page of the indictment directly before me, and set his finger on the circled symbol without touching the paper. It was a compact form, something between a cursive abbreviation and a procedural notation, the kind of mark that would pass unremarked in a document of this density, unless one was specifically looking for it. "Tell me what you see," he said. I examined it with honest concentration. "A symbol of the same general character as the others around it," I said. "A legal abbreviation of some kind. I cannot read its meaning." "Its intended meaning," Holmes said, "is a reference to the procedural step of sworn attestation, the formal confirmation of a witness statement before a commissioner. In the cipher system employed throughout this document, it is used correctly in every other instance in which it appears. There are 4 such instances in total. In 3 of them, the symbol is rendered in its complete form." He pointed to 2 earlier passages. "In the 4th instance, the one I have circled, one element of the symbol has been omitted, a single closing stroke that, in the full form, loops back and terminates in a particular direction. In this version, the stroke has been left open." I studied the difference. It was, once Holmes had directed my attention to it, visible, a hair's breadth of absent line. "A copyist's slip," I suggested. "Fatigue, perhaps, or a momentary inattention." "That is exactly what it appears to be," Holmes said. And that appearance is precisely what makes it significant rather than negligible." He sat back. "The open form of this symbol is not a variant, Watson. It is not an alternative rendering that any authority on chancery procedure would recognise as equivalent. It is, in fact, the representation of a procedural step that was formally abolished by administrative order in 1863, a step relating to a preliminary attestation process that was superseded entirely by the modern form and has not appeared in any active legal instrument since that date." I set down my fork. "So the writer inadvertently used an obsolete form. He used it because it exists in the reference material he was consulting, specifically in the appendices of the 1821 compendium, laying where the old and new forms appear in proximity, with a distinction between them marked only by a footnote that runs to 3 lines at the bottom of a page. The footnote explains that the open form was discontinued in 63. Holmes turned the compendium toward me, and I found the page without difficulty. The footnote was precisely as he described. Small printed, easily overlooked, easily misread by someone moving rapidly through unfamiliar material. A practitioner thoroughly versed in the old forms would not make this error. Greaves has worked with legal documentation for 3 decades. The distinction would be instinctive to him. Sir Lionel, who employed these very systems in his early career, would know it as well as he knows his own name. But Whittaker, I said slowly, studying the appendices with the diligence of a careful student rather than the fluency of long practice, would read the old form and the new form in proximity, and unless his eye caught the footnote, might take them as interchangeable variants. Holmes closed the compendium with a quiet deliberateness. He did not know the form was obsolete because he had no practical context in which obsolescence would register. He had studied the system but never used it. A student error? Watson, the error not of carelessness but of incomplete knowledge, the most honest kind of error there is. I considered this carefully, weighing it as I imagined a sceptical mind might. Is it sufficient? I asked. A single symbol? A footnote? Whittaker's counsel could argue the difference is microscopic and the inference speculative. Taken alone, yes. Holmes rose and went to the window. The morning had produced a pale, clean light of the kind that follows 2 days of rain. The city briefly scoured and bright before it resumed its habitual grey. But it is not taken alone. It is taken in conjunction with the paper, the ink composition, the blotter impressions, the presence of the relevant reference volumes in his chambers, the content derived from a trial summary accessible to him specifically, and the structure of the cipher itself, composed in the sectional, a reference-dependent manner of a careful student rather than a fluent practitioner. He turned. Each of these items is individually explicable by coincidence or alternative interpretation. Together, Watson, they form a chain of a very different character. The kind that does not break, I said, the kind that tightens as you examine it. He came back to the table. There is one further element I have not yet mentioned, because I wish to verify it before placing any weight upon it. He drew from beneath the indictment a sheet of his own notes, on which he had written a sequence of dates. The trial summary of the Dacre case was entered into the Lincoln's Inn Library collection in September of this year, 6 weeks before the indictment was delivered to Whittaker's chambers. It was signed out on 3 occasions between its entry and the delivery. On each occasion, the borrower's entry in the register was made under a name I shall not share with you now, because the register can be examined at any time by Lestrade or any authorised party, and it would be improper for me to place that information in my notes before I have confirmed with the librarian that the signature is genuine. He said this with the precision of a man who had thought carefully about the manner in which evidence ought to be handled, and I understood and respected it. "But you expect the signature to be Whittaker's," I said. "I expect it to be Whittaker's," he agreed. We sat for a moment in the quiet of the morning, the fire settled and warm, the document lying between us like a question that had at last been adequately answered. I thought of the young barrister in his Lincoln's Inn chambers, earnest, as Holmes had said, sincere in his conviction that an injustice had been allowed to stand, clever in his construction of an instrument to expose it, and undone by 3 lines of print at the foot of a page he had not read with sufficient care. He believed it, I said. He genuinely believed Sir Lionel had done wrong. "I think he did," Holmes said, and there was nothing dismissive in his tone. "That is the part of this affair which resists any simple assessment. A man acting from genuine moral conviction, employing dishonest means, arriving at a conclusion that may not be wholly without foundation. It is not a comfortable picture. Watson." He rose and took his coat from the hook, which is precisely why I intend to lay every detail before Whittaker himself before I lay any of it before Lestrade. He deserves the opportunity to speak rather than merely to be spoken about. He consulted his watch. "I have sent word this morning asking Whittaker to call upon us at 2:00. I suggest that in the meantime you might consider how a good man persuades himself that a wrong method serves a right purpose. Since it is a question you will see illustrated this afternoon at rather close quarters." He said it without severity, but I felt the full weight of it as I cleared the breakfast things and went to find my coat. It was, I reflected, a question rather older than the Dacre case and considerably harder to resolve than any cipher. Holmes was already on the stair, and the morning was waiting. Chapter 9. The Ciphered Indictment Explained. Whittaker arrived at 2:00 with the punctuality of a man who respects appointments, and Mrs. Hudson showed him up with her customary discretion. He came in briskly, still in his working coat with the collar turned against the November cold, and took in the sitting-room with a single encompassing glance that registered, I thought, the arrangement of the table, the indictment laid open at its 4th page, the compendium beside it, and Holmes's annotated sheets in a neat stack, before his expression settled back into its practised composure. He sat in the chair Holmes indicated. He declined tea. He folded his hands in his lap with the unhurried attention of a man who is prepared for a difficult cross-examination, and considers himself adequately equipped. "You have made progress," he said. "I have reached a conclusion," Holmes replied, from his own chair across the table. His tone was level and entirely without theatre. "I wish to put it to you directly before taking any further steps, because I believe you are an intelligent man, and because I think you are owed the opportunity to hear it clearly rather than encounter it obliquely." Something shifted in Whittaker's eyes, not alarm precisely, but a quality of heightened attention, as though a door had opened onto a room he had always known existed, but had hoped might remain closed a little longer. He said nothing. Holmes began with the paper. He laid it out without haste, moving from point to point in the ordered, unhurried manner of a man who has built a structure he is confident will stand, and is therefore in no need of rushing through its presentation. The watermark from the Lincoln's Inn stationer, the 2 ink compositions and their implication of separate compositional sessions, the blotter in Whittaker's chambers, and the practice impressions of cipher symbols that lay within it in the scattered pattern of a student rehearsing unfamiliar forms, the compendium and its companion volumes, present on Whittaker's shelves and showing, Holmes had examined the spine hinges on his visit, the slight loosening of recent and repeated consultation at specific pages, the content of the decoded passages, derived not from personal knowledge but from the language of a summary document, accessible to Whittaker through the inn's library, and signed out 3 times in the 6 weeks preceding the indictment's delivery. Throughout this recitation, Whittaker sat with his hands still folded, and his eyes fixed on Holmes with a concentrated, unblinking steadiness that was itself a form of admission, the attention of a man following an account he recognises rather than one he is hearing for the first time. Holmes paused at this point and looked at him. "I have not yet mentioned the library register," he said. "I thought it considerate to leave that for the end, since it is the only element that requires external confirmation, and it would be discourteous to present an incomplete chain as though it were whole." "The signature is mine," Whittaker said. His voice was quiet and quite steady. It was the voice, I thought, of a man who has decided that a particular kind of relief is available only on the far side of acknowledgement, and who has chosen to proceed directly toward it rather than defer the crossing any longer. Holmes nodded. Then he placed his finger on the circled symbol, the open form, the abolished procedural step, and explained it with the same measured precision he had used with me that morning. The footnote and its 3 lines, the distinction between old and new forms, the way in which a careful student moving rapidly through unfamiliar appendices might pass over exactly such a detail. Now, when he had finished, the room was quiet. Somewhere below, Mrs. Hudson moved about her kitchen, and the distant note of a street vendor drifted up from Baker Street, thin and intermittent, and was gone. "You composed the indictment," Holmes said. "You delivered it to your own chambers. You brought it to me in the character of its recipient. You intended, if I identified its source, which you could not discount, to be positioned as the concerned junior who had acted responsibly throughout. And you intended, if I exposed the accusations against Sir Lionel, rather than the mechanism of their delivery, to be the man who had brought a significant judicial impropriety to light. Whittaker breathed in slowly and out again. Yes, he said. Tell me, Holmes said. And now there was something different in his voice. Not softened precisely, but opened, as though he had laid down a tool he no longer required, and was speaking in a register that had nothing to do with demonstration. Tell me what you found in that trial summary. For the first time since he had sat down, something moved in Whittaker's face that was not composure. He looked briefly younger. The earnest, pale-featured man who had climbed our stair 10 days ago with a leather satchel held rather too tightly. Sefton's deposition is referenced in the summary, he said. Not its contents, those are described only in outline, but its existence, its submission for filing, and a marginal note in the original clerk's hand indicating that it had been received and registered. The registered number is there. The deposition itself has no subsequent record. It was received, numbered, and then nothing. He paused. I know what that means, Mr. Holmes. I have read enough trial records to understand what it means when a numbered document simply ceases to exist between receipt and production. You interpreted it as deliberate suppression, Holmes said. What else could it be? Holmes considered this with care. Negligence, he said. Misfiling so complete as to become permanent loss, the ordinary entropy of an overwhelmed clerical system. I do not say these are probable, only that they are possible, and that possibility is precisely what separates suspicion from proof. He paused. You had suspicion. You chose to act as though you had proof. Whittaker accepted this without protest. I told myself that if the accusations were laid before the right authority, before you specifically, the truth would emerge regardless of whether my method was entirely proper. It is a comfortable argument, Holmes said. It places the moral burden upon the instrument rather than the hand that fashions it. The directness of this landed visibly. Whittaker looked at the table for a moment. I knew Mrs. Dacre might be suspected, he said. I told myself the evidence against her was too thin to hold. It held long enough for her to spend 2 nights in custody, I said, and I did not attempt to keep the edge from my voice. Whittaker looked at me. In his expression I saw no evasion, only the particular quality of a man confronting the specific human cost of an abstraction he had allowed himself not to examine closely enough. I am sorry for that, he said, genuinely. I believed him. That was, in some ways, the most uncomfortable part of the afternoon. Holmes rose and stood before the fireplace. Here is what will now occur, he said, in the tone of a man concluding a negotiation in which he has determined the terms in advance. I shall inform Lestrade today that the evidence against Mrs. Dacre will not support the charge, and I shall provide him with sufficient grounds to release her without delay. I shall indicate that the document's true origin has been identified, and that the author has voluntarily acknowledged the fact to me in this room. Whittaker looked up sharply. Voluntarily. You came to this appointment of your own free will. You did not wait to be compelled. That is not nothing, and I shall not misrepresent it. Holmes clasped his hands behind his back. What Lestrade does with the information is a matter for his professional judgment and ultimately for the law. What the law determines is not within my power to control. What I can tell you is that the nature of the charge, if there is a charge, will be shaped considerably by the manner in which the matter is presented, and the manner in which the matter is presented will reflect, at least in part, the fact that you sat in that chair and did not prevaricate. He said it without false comfort and without unnecessary hardship, and Whittaker received it in the same spirit. There remained one matter, and it was I who raised it. Sir Lionel, I said, if Sefton's deposition did exist and was suppressed, the underlying question remains unanswered. Holmes looked at me steadily. It does, he said, and it will be answered by proper means or it will not be answered at all. That is a distinction which this entire affair has been, in its unhappy way, an extended demonstration of. He looked at Whittaker. You were not wrong to believe the question deserved asking. You were wrong in the method by which you chose to ask it." Whitaker stood, and there was in his posture something that was neither defeat nor exoneration, but the specific gravity of a man who has passed through a reckoning, and arrived, somewhat changed, upon the other side. He offered Holmes his hand. Holmes took it, briefly and without ceremony. "I will send word to Lestrade within the hour," he said. "I suggest you make yourself available to him this afternoon." Whitaker nodded, and took his hat and went. We heard his steps on the stair, slower on the descent than they had been on the ascent, and then the street door, and then nothing. I sat for a moment in the quiet. Holmes returned to his chair and picked up his pipe, and looked into the middle distance with the expression he wore when a case had ended, and he was not entirely certain how he felt about the ending. "A good man," I said at last, "or the capacity for one." Holmes struck a match. "The distance between the two," he said, "is precisely the size of one unread footnote." He drew on his pipe and watched the smoke rise toward the ceiling, which is to say, not very large and not very small, depending entirely upon the moment. He said nothing further, and I did not press him. The afternoon settled around us grey and quiet, and the fire burned steadily on. Chapter 10. A Question of Justice. The weeks that followed the resolution of the Ciphered Indictment affair moved with the particular quietness that descends upon Baker Street after a case has spent itself, leaving behind it a residue of thought that neither Holmes nor I was entirely ready to set aside. November deepened into a cold that stripped the last leaves from the plane trees and drove the fog back from the river in grey, rolling sheets, and our rooms acquired the sealed, lamp-lit quality of a ship riding at anchor while the season blew itself out around us. Mrs. Eleanor Dacre was released from custody on the afternoon of the same day that Holmes sent word to Lestrade. I know this because Lestrade called upon us that evening, not with the bearing of a man conceding a point, which would have been uncharacteristic, but with the more nuanced expression of one who has absorbed a correction and is quietly determining what use to make of it. And he sat in the basket chair and accepted his tea and told us that the charge against Mrs. Dacre had been withdrawn, and that she had been conveyed home by a police constable with what he described, with some care, as appropriate consideration. "She took it well," Lestrade said. Better than the situation warranted, I thought. She seemed less concerned with what had happened to her than with what it might mean for the larger question. "The larger question being whether her husband was wrongly convicted," I said. "Just so." He turned his cup in his hands. "I confess, Mr. Holmes, that when you began suggesting the evidence against her had been arranged, I thought you were finding complexity where there was none. I am revising that view." "I never doubted you would," Holmes said, in a tone from which all condescension was genuinely absent. Whitaker, as Holmes had directed, made himself available to Lestrade that same afternoon. The precise nature of the charge ultimately brought against him I shall not detail here, except to say that it was considerably less severe than the circumstances might at first have warranted, for two reasons that Lestrade acknowledged with a candour I found rather admirable. The first was that the voluntary admission, given without compulsion, in Holmes's sitting-room before any formal accusation had been made, carried genuine weight in the assessment of the man's character and intent. The second was that the underlying question the indictment had raised, however irregularly, was one that the relevant authorities were now disinclined to dismiss without examination. That examination, I understand, proceeded quietly and over several months, well beyond the period covered by these notes. I shall say only that a review of the Dacre trial records was formally initiated, that the question of the missing deposition was placed before a proper inquiry, and that the broker Sefton was located, retired, in moderate health, living in the market town of Shrewsbury, and his account of events recorded by persons with the authority to receive it. Whether that account proved decisive I cannot say with certainty, since the matter was conducted with the discretion appropriate to proceedings of such delicacy. But I am aware, from sources I need not identify, that its contents were not without consequence. Sir Lionel Markham retired from the bench in the following January, some months earlier than his previously announced intention. The retirement was presented to the public in the customary manner, a brief notice in the legal press, a gathering of colleagues, a dinner at his inn. He made no public statement regarding the Dacre case. He did, however, arrange through his solicitors for a modest annual payment to be made to Mrs. Eleanor Dacre, the grounds for which were described in the relevant instrument as an act of private recognition rather than legal obligation, a form of words that told its own story to anyone who cared to read it with attention. I paid a call on Mrs. Dacre in Bloomsbury some 3 weeks after these arrangements had been confirmed. She received me in the same neat, cold sitting room, though I noticed that a new curtain had been hung at the window and that the flower box outside, for the first time since I'd seen it, had been cleared of its dead stems and filled with winter greenery. She was composed as she invariably was, but there was something different in her bearing. Not happiness precisely, for happiness seemed too light a word for what this woman had sustained and what had been returned to her, but a kind of settling, as though a weight she had carried at a slight angle for 15 years had at last been shifted to the upright. She asked after Holmes. I told her he was well, and occupied with a matter concerning a fraudulent music publisher in Soho which appeared to amuse him considerably more than its surface gravity warranted. She smiled at this, the first time I had seen her do so, and asked me to convey her thanks, which I promised to do. As I rose to leave, she said, quietly and without particular emphasis, "My husband knew Mr. Holmes, or that is, Dr. Watson, forgive me. My husband wrote to me from the prison in his 2nd year. He said he had accepted that the truth would not come out in his lifetime, but that truths of this kind had a way of outlasting the people who had buried them." She paused. He was right. It only took rather longer than either of us anticipated. I walked back to Baker Street through a cold, clear afternoon that had the sharp, washed quality of approaching winter, and I found Holmes in his chair with his violin resting unplayed across his knee, looking at nothing in particular with an expression that meant he was thinking about something he had not decided to speak about yet. I relayed Mrs. Dacre's thanks. He received them with a small nod. "And Whittaker?" I asked, settling into my own chair. "He has been called before the inn's disciplinary committee," Holmes said. "The outcome, I understand, is likely to be a formal censure and a period of suspension rather than disbarment. His counsel, with, I am told, some external support whose provenance the committee was invited not to examine too closely, argued successfully that sincere conviction of a genuine wrong, however misguided in its expression, was a different matter from the pursuit of personal gain by corrupt means." He set the bow across the strings in a gesture that produced no sound. "He will return to practice, I expect. Whether the experience will have improved or merely chastened him remains to be seen." "Is there a difference?" I asked. Holmes looked at me with the sideways attention he gave to questions he considered worth answering properly. "A chastened man has been taught that his method failed," he said. "An improved man has understood why the method was wrong before it failed. The first kind learns caution. The second learns something rather more durable." He drew the bow across the strings in a single exploratory note that died in the warm air of the room. "I am not certain which Whittaker is. I suspect he is not yet certain himself." I thought of the young barrister descending our stair, the slower step, the quality of a man emerging from a reckoning, and I thought of the unread footnote and what Holmes had said about the distance between a good man and the capacity for one, and I found I did not have a confident answer either. The fire settled with a soft collapse of coals. Outside, Baker Street was beginning its early evening commerce, the lamplighter making his rounds, the cabs gathering at the corner, the newsboys calling the late edition at the top of their considerable lungs, the ordinary indifferent machinery of the city. Holmes drew the bow across the strings again, more purposefully this time, and found the opening phrase of something I recognised vaguely as Mendelssohn, searching, slightly melancholic, the kind of passage that does not so much resolve as recede. It was, I thought, entirely appropriate. "It is a dangerous thing, Watson," he said, between phrases without looking up from the instrument, "when a man sets himself to pursue justice without the discipline of reason. The line between reformer and mischief-maker is thinner than most suppose." "And yet," I said. In this instance, something approaching justice appears to have resulted. In this instance, Holmes agreed, which is not an argument for the method. It is an argument for the occasional mercy of circumstance, which is a rather different and considerably less reliable thing. He played another phrase. We should not, in my view, rely upon it. He returned to his music then, and I to the notes from which this account has been drawn. And the evening came on around Baker Street in the ordinary way, with the lamps and the cold and the city going about its enormous indifferent business, and in our sitting room the fire burning and the music moving through its unresolved searching phrases, and the small particular satisfaction of a truth that had outlasted the people who had buried it, arriving at last, imperfectly, obliquely, by means none of its principles would have chosen, into something that was not quite justice, but was closer to it than the silence had been. It was, I've come to think, as much as these affairs ever deliver. Holmes, when I said as much to him later that evening, considered it for a moment, and then gave a slight, decisive nod. Precisely so, he said, and a great deal more than nothing, which is, in the end, what we are here to attempt. He set down his violin, picked up his pipe, and returned to the monograph on medieval legal shorthand that had occupied him on the morning Adrian Whittaker first climbed our stair. Whether it had been waiting for him all this time, or whether he had simply returned to it by way of completion, I did not ask. Some questions, I've learned, are better appreciated than answered. The case of the Ciphered Indictment was closed.